Admiral, dear fellow participants in the room and online, welcome for this second panel about protecting critical offshore infrastructure from seabed to space. As you all know, for approximately 50 years, the development of critical offshore infrastructure shaped the world economy. It started just after the first oil shock in the 70s with the boom of oil offshore exploration and production. Then in the 90s with gas, in the 2000 with data cables, electric interconnectors, renewable marine energy, and this highlighted a very specific point that we navies have to be aware, is that nowadays most of the world's economy is shaped by this infrastructure that we dub critical. And for navies, for sailors, it's very important because we used to protect sea lanes of communications. And now we're dealing with an infrastructure issue. So we have to adapt in protecting nowadays both fluxes and infrastructure, moving assets and fixed assets from seabed to space, as the different panelists already highlighted this topic. Of course, you all know it has already been highlighted that all of these infrastructure are critical to our daily lives, to our data, to our digital issue, to our electricity, to our supply of hydrocarbons. Yet if they are critical, they are also vulnerable. Nord Stream in 2022, EXAIL 2 in 2024, ELISA data in December 25 are only a few examples of what can happen at sea on this critical infrastructure. For this panel, we'll deal with different topics such as opacity, gray zone operations, hybrid warfare, plausible deniability, that are both ancient and new for the navies, and that have to be considered as well as important as the return of high-intensity classic naval warfare. To explore this topic, we have today 4 experts with various backgrounds. First of all, Marc Delorme. You have a career of a submarine commanding officer, commanding both SSN and SSBN in the French Navy. You were also submarine technology foresight officer at the naval staff before joining the French company Thales in 2012, where you are now project director on autonomous anti-submarine warfare and cyber surveillance. Then we have also Annabelle Livet, research fellow from the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique in Paris. You are both specialist in energy, but also in the French-German relations in defense, but not only in defense. And you're also a PhD candidate dealing with the interconnection and cooperation in energy issue between European Union and NATO. Vice-admiral d'escadre Didier Maleterre. You're also a submarine officer, commanding also both SSN and SSBN. Yet you have also a very interesting experience at the military political level. You were the director mass destruction weapon counter-proliferation and export control at the DGRIS, at the French ministry. You were also advisor for defense at the General Secretariat for Defense and National Security, director of the Task Force Ukraine at the Joint Staff, and finally, deputy commander of NATO MARCOM until 2025, before joining this summer the French company EXAIL as vice president and defense advisor. And last but not least, we have also an active duty officer, Captain Henk Warnar, from the Dutch Navy. You have both an experience as a surface and a submarine officer, so deal really in undersea issues. You were also, you served in MARCOM, and nowadays you're associate professor in strategy and naval operation at the Netherlands Defense Academy. And in the same time, also PhD candidate at King's College under the supervision of Professor Andrew Lambert. So, Captain Warnar, I will start with you. Could you explain us the importance of green waters that in naval strategy historically had been the forgotten part of naval strategy that used to deal of the issue between brown waters and blue waters. So these green waters that are in between, what is their strategic relevance today?
Yeah, well, the short answer to why these critical infrastructure in these green or brown or whatever waters is of vital importance to Europe is that it is part of our economic infrastructure, and as being that, it is vital for European. But then the question is how to understand that. Why is that of vital importance? And to understand that, I think we need to understand what kind of a power Europe is nowadays in these turbulent times of an eroding rule-based order, a multi-polar situation where panels are shifting. We need to ask ourselves the question, what kind of a power is Europe? And I'm just suggesting here that to characterize Europe as a power, I think Europe as a whole should be seen as a sea power. And then the question is what do we need to nowadays understand of what actually is, what does it mean to be a sea power? And that may be a little bit different here than the traditional meaning of those words. You know, traditionally we have seen the island countries such as Britain as the sea powers, whereas we've seen and we've regarded countries such as France and Germany as the continental powers, and we made those distinguishing. Distinguishments made by the factor of geography and space. So to translate that into nowadays, we need to understand how the meaning of space has changed in nowadays time. And I think if we understand space and what it means now, we come to this new, my conclusion that I want to propose, that Europe as a whole is a sea power. So what does it mean to be a sea power? Well, in short, a sea power means, in short, two things. First, rely on trade for the wealth. And secondly, not having a big army to invade other countries or stabilize other countries. Those two things characterize a sea power. They've done it through history, starting at the old Greece empires, the Venetians, the Dutch Empire, 17th century, 19th Britain, etc. So how's that nowadays? Obviously, what the role for the Navy is, and in between that. Being a sea power, you know, Europe is not a military power such as the United States. Yeah, we don't have these big armies. We are not an autocratic country power as Russia. We are a democracy, slow in decision making, both our strength and weakness. And we are not a people's power such as China. But what have we to understand what it means dominating this volume of space, we need to understand there's much more than just traditionally sailing ships on the sea line of communications. It's much more than that, and it has always been in the past. You know, Britain in the 19th century, it was not only commanding the sea by their navies because they could not command the whole global world. Of equal importance to Britain's sea power was that they were just possessing the whole network of coaling station, the energy infrastructure, and they had a whole system of WT wireless telegraphy throughout the world. So they were just having information dominance. And it is those kind of features, these kinds of infrastructure that dominates that global maritime power that Britain had in the 19th century. So if we look at those characteristics of economic infrastructure, it's not only moving goods in ships, it is also moving energy to all those those pipelines, electricity. It is moving money, you know, our whole financial infrastructure. It is moving data, all these data cables, and all that together is the infrastructure on which economic powers such as Europe very much rely on them. So it is of their vital interest to protect these and to control these. Now, obviously, being a sea power is not just only attractive, it also means very much dependency. It has vulnerabilities. Because in a network, you're easily being cut off. So how to control that? in these brown waters, and it is not only these brown waters, because at the land, these cables, it's probably much a wiser thing to control them via the software companies with these software houses at land. On the other end of the waters, we also have, submarines like the Belgorod submarines that will never get into any brown waters, but at the Atlantic, they are still a threat to our cable and our infrastructure. So it is the whole system, the global system. It doesn't make sense to only protect infrastructure in one end. It's a global network, so it needs a global protection. So that's the way how to look at it. So how to deal with that? I think there's two elements that are vital in here now to protection. It's two words, it's simple, two principles of how sea powers secure their interest. And one of them is coalition building, and the other one is ordering. And that's not only a rule-based order. Yeah, many may ask you that is under in decline, but rule-based order is much more than the right to invade another country or not, or the International Criminal Court. No, it is very much about regulating the financial or the whole economical infrastructure. That is the kind of order that particularly weak countries that we need to protect on them. And that is, I think, the lens that we how to look at protecting critical infrastructure. So, and on doing that, coordinating that, we need to create a transparency in that way. And therefore, Europe is a normative power, so we need to use that regulations to create that transparency. That, so for example, for Russia, it is no longer able to operate its shadow fleets. The best defense against a shadow fleet is to put as much light on it and to create as much as possible transparency on it. So it was possibly, already in 1911, Julian Corbett wrote down that in the future, because they had wireless communications, they would know where the threat would come from. So he considered that they would no longer be a threat because they would know where the threat was. So therefore, convoying would no longer be an issue. Well, that was overtaken by events in World War I and II, but he was very much ahead of time. We are now in the age where we are able to coordinate this transparency. We are able to coordinate all this information going to make sure that this shadow fleet can no longer hid in the dark. That's how our strategies should be. So instead of what we've done insofar as doing rule of law is not only freedom of navigation operations, etc., but enforcing regulation. Enforcing, for example, that Chinese ships cannot longer just by policy switch off their AIS if they transit through European waters. That is the kind of regulation I think that we need to work on protecting that infrastructure.
Thanks. So, information dominance, centrality of these critical infrastructure, critical assets, vulnerability of these critical assets. So we discuss a lot about this issue of vulnerability of our society's reliance on this issue. So Annabelle Livet, I'm turning to you now, because when looking at energy, for example, the development of energy infrastructure at sea appears as particularly impressive. When looking, for example, at the last 30 years, could you tell us more about the importance of the sea in both hydrocarbons and electricity production and transmission?
Ready? Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much, Nicolas, and also many thanks once more for the kind invitation here. We try to remain concise, but namely when we are talking about energy and this energy-sea nexus, let's say, I would highlight maybe three main aspects. The first one is related actually to the resources that are at sea, and because now actually, and historically speaking, it's a sort of shift, that is a bit ongoing already for decades now, and it is about that the fact more than 80% actually of the new discoveries for hydrocarbons are actually offshore. It's not anymore onshore. Why so? Not necessarily only because there is nothing new to discover in onshore, even if there were already many things that have been discovered so far, but it's also about, for instance, social acceptance that is a bit easier to get actually when you're offshore rather than onshore. But also what we notice on that, it's those new discoveries and those resources are most of the part actually in terms of volumes bigger than what you have actually onshore, but also deeper and more far away from the shore, actually, which is as well something to take into account, because when we are talking about green sea and let's say the different juridical aspects actually at sea, it definitely has its importance actually to take into account. A second aspect named next to the resources is actually the transport. When we are talking about transport of energy, of course, we are thinking, and for very good reasons, about the transport of energy products such as oil, but also gas and coal, but uranium as well, and so on, because all of those together, all of those energy products still corresponds today to, on average, 40% actually of all the maritime shipping actually globally. And when we are looking a bit more in details to Europe, actually this proportion, I don't have the figure, unfortunately, but the proportion, we can assume it's much higher now since 2022, since we do not import anymore from Russia, and especially not from the terrestrial routes, but rather now from the maritime routes. So this is also an impact, an additional significance, let's say, from sea on that. But then also considering about transport, as it has been a bit mentioned, this is about, what I mentioned is above the surface of the sea, but now when we are going a bit in the depth, you have, of course, plenty of undersea infrastructures, from the pipelines to the cables for, in this case, I will just focus on the power systems, but for the pipelines, maybe an interesting thing on that is that I'm not sure we are in an era now where we will have, further big projects of interconnection, of pipelines interconnection. Why so? Just because of geopolitical instability right now. It's not possible actually to interconnect in such a long distances actually on pipeline. But in the same case, we can notice that since we are discovering more resources offshore that are actually quite far away from the shore, those pipelines are actually still needed to interconnect actually the fields to the shore. But in the same times, then you can observe with the cables two main dynamics. You have the cables to interconnect, let's say, two countries, two energy systems. You have it, for instance, the Celtic interconnector between France and Ireland, which is quite an interesting example, but you have plenty of them. But you have as well, and it is an increasing dynamic as well on those interconnections to offshore energy projects to produce electricity, and that are actually cross-boarding. So it means actually now it's more not only a cable, from a point A to a point B, but actually cables that are related to a hub actually. And it comes to the very last point, and I will be concise, I promise. It comes to the last point, which is actually that now the surface, some areas actually of the sea are also used for the electricity production. And this is actually also new in a sense of course, wind energy has been, in the mind for decades now in terms of diversifications, because it's also important for electrification. It really helps as well to have more production capacities, which are needed for the countries. But in the same times, when talking about offshore is interesting because, of course, you have more wind and more capacities, and you can have bigger turbines, and so you have plenty of advantages of that. In the same case, of course, it creates as well, as for every decentralized systems, new point of vulnerabilities. And talking about transparencies, for instance, or non-transparency, in the case of wind park energies, it's pretty interesting because on a side, it's transparent, but in the same time, not at all, actually. So it opens as well many questions about that, juridical ones, but we can also come back to it later on. And but maybe to finish on that, it's not only let's say a shift that we can, or a dynamic we can observe in Europe, because of course we are talking a lot about wind energy, offshore wind energy in Europe. But actually, when we are comparing globally, another big player, which is actually the front runner currently, unfortunately, is China. And it is interesting because, when we are comparing the current figures now, we are in Europe, with 37 gigawatts installed capacity, and in China it's about 42. And both, let's say, regions plan actually to grow up actually 100 gigawatt capacities. For us, it would be by 2030. We will see if we can reach it. And for China, it should be actually next year. And this is pretty interesting as well. I don't know actually how feasible it could be, if it could be or not. It's a bet. But still, what is important here for us is to have this idea of conceiving actually the sea as well as an era actually for energy production, and sometimes as well even co-production, because it's not only sometimes about electricity but also thinking about the projects in the North Sea, for instance, with hydrogen as well, or derivatives. So those dynamics are actually very important as well to take into account, because then it has a direct interconnection to the energy systems that are onshore, that are actually within the national territories. So yes, I will stop here. No.
Thank you, Annabelle. You gave us very interesting figures and the importance, especially of growth of this importance of this infrastructure. What's interesting that both of you discussed about norms and jurisdictions. I'm turning to Marc Delorme, as a large part of this infrastructure is underwater, and especially on the seabed, discussing, for example, as a telecommunication or power cables. According to you, how to ensure their protection, especially out of territorial waters, to jump out to the jurisdiction and norms issue?
I'm afraid I have to go a little bit in technology. The Chief of Staff evoked a few minutes ago the transparency. And yesterday, during the session of operation, we had the opacity of the ocean. Actually, the ocean is still full of opacity, which allow to operate safe submarine forces for the moment. And so actually, this underwater question to detect some activity under the sea is still complex. Of course, as said Captain Warnar, this is a global answer. I mean, the whole and comprehensive picture of the maritime tactical surveillance contribute, of course, to the surveillance of this infrastructure. That means it was the sense, and maybe Didier will come back on that. It was the sense of the creation at Marcom last year of this dedicated office in order to allocate the intelligence and gather the intelligence and focus this intelligence towards particularly this infrastructure, but gathering the global tactical maritime picture and share the information. If I come more precisely on the infrastructure itself, as far as we observe the worldwide trends, it's almost all the same approach, which means a mix of unmanned system, vehicle platform, and fixed installation. And we have to cope very quickly to the physics and limit of the physics, which mean the acoustic propagation in the water, and all the parameters which allow or not to detect. The first one in this consideration is the ambient noise, meaning if we want to protect some infrastructure close to the shore, like in the vicinity of harbor or industrial plants, etc., it's not at all the question of passive world, for those who know that difference in active and passive. And of course, we have to go in some tools of active detection in terms of acoustic, which means active means a lot of infrastructure by themselves to perform, to create acoustic energy and receive the echo. Of course, obviously, I go directly to the question of cables, power cables, telecom cables, or pipe. We have 1.5 million kilometers of telecom cables in the world. It will be not reasonable to address the detection on this infrastructure with active tools everywhere. That's why the question of drone, maybe Didier will come back on that too. Of course, we can use different platforms and vehicles to have a survey, regular survey, dedicated survey, but it's also a huge issue of logistic to support a huge fleet of platform in order to be able to protect 24/7 this type of infrastructure. So the idea is to find a good technology breakthrough, to have a solution, to have a good, accessible, affordable solution to have an efficient survey of this infrastructure. And the fact is, we have this technology, I go quickly, but of DAS, Distributed Acoustic Sensing. For those who are not so familiar, is the ability to transform the fiber optic itself in a sensor. So, of course, you have fiber optic in telecom cable by nature. You have also fiber optic in power cable. You have also fiber optic alongside the pipeline. So all these infrastructure today are fitted with optical fiber. And this technology is able to transform the infrastructure itself in its own sensor, which is particularly seducing because you don't have to add any more infrastructure in addition to the infrastructure itself to survey the infrastructure. But you use the infrastructure with this system. So DAS is emerging for maybe 20 years, but more recently, during the last 5 years, due to two specific progress in technology, which is the accuracy of laser frequency distribution and the calculation power that you can put behind the data to obtain a real-time response of the sensor. And these two parameters allow today to think about real-time operational tools to have a surveillance on this cable. And this is not only the matter to have a DAS providing, which is the capability to create virtual hydrophone sensor alongside the fiber, but it's also the addition layer of specific competencies as you can have in the company who are experts in the sonar system, which is the case for Thales, but we are a few companies able to this level in Europe, which is the capability not only to operate single hydrophone virtually alongside the fiber, but to gather this hydrophone in a coherent calculation to shape virtual array, sonar array. So it means that typically you can shape a 1 kilometer array laid on the seabed, and you recreate what submariners are used to, which is operating a long linear array behind the submarine. It's the same technology, so it's a small club of companies which are able to do that. It's a good perspective to have a affordable tool to operate this survey on the fiber.
Many thanks for this point on the underwater technology. And as our panel is entitled on the protection from seabed to space, I'm turning to Admiral Maleterre. How to integrate space-based technologies for surveillance and protection of this offshore critical infrastructure?
Yes, thank you, Nicolas. Just to start with, let me highlight the importance of the protection of the CUI. And let me remind you what happened in the Baltic region in December 2024. At that time, I was working for NATO as deputy commander of NATO Allied Maritime Command. I know that there is some NATO admirals in the room this afternoon. And in December 2024, the 25th of December, Christmas, the oil tanker Sea Eagle broke an undersea power cable linking Finland to Estonia. So this power cable was very important because, in fact, they have two cables for the delivery of electricity for Estonia. So if the second cable was broke, the Finland Estonia will be in the dark. So this oil tanker damaged the cable by dragging the anchor across the seabed for dozens of kilometers, and that was a great that's part of the hybrid action. So you may understand the importance of the CUI because it constitutes the backbone of our global economy and prosperity of our societies. As you mentioned, undersea cable carry more than 95% of internet. That means financial transaction. That means cloud service. And we have also, like you mentioned, undersea pipeline, transporting oil, gas, or electricity, like the case between Finland and Estonia. So it's always very, very difficult when we enter the hybrid action to identify if it's deliberate or not. Is it incompetent crew, perhaps, or is it deliberate attacks with a bag of Russian GRU money giving to the crew? So it's difficult, but the damage is very, very sensitive for the country. For NATO, with this mission to deter on the shore, it's very important for the protection of the CUI for the Baltic nation. So as Marc mentioned, NATO at political level decided to set up an operation, Baltic Sentry, to try to better secure all the critical undersea infrastructures, because you know that's a question of sovereignty. So NATO is helping to coordinate the action and to be able to intervene in case of some specific suspicious activities. And the NAC decided as well to set up a center for the security of the critical undersea infrastructures in Northwood, within Markham. So to have a very good maritime domain awareness, NATO decided also to set up a Task Force X organized by ACT, Amiral Vendier. So with this Task Force X in the Baltic, we were able to operate nearly 70 drones, USV and UUVs in Poland with the US, because Baltops operation was at the moment. Also in Sweden, in Finland, and also in Denmark. So, and we use also space-based technology. You know that the satellite constellation is growing, particularly for the low Earth orbit in the civilian, but also in the military. And they give you a very good information to have the best maritime domain awareness and recognize maritime picture using electromagnetic imagery radar coming from space. So that's very important. And just moving back to the CUI, EXAIL, where I'm working at the moment, has experienced 20 years of experience, particularly in offshore subsea operation. Particularly, what it's important is to have accurate navigation when you operate up to 2,000 meters. You need to have very accurate positioning. We have acoustic ranging sensors for 3D positioning, but also we use drones, USV, for the survey and monitoring of the cable laydown. And when you have some experience in this domain, you know that you can be helpful for the protection of the CUI. When you are working in mine countermeasures is very close to the protection of the CUI. That's a lot of experience, very helpful to protect these very strategic infrastructures.
Many thanks. All of you discussed about civilian and military cooperation, civilian and military coordination. But there is also an issue we need to address with the development of this infrastructure, because some of them could cause issues with military equipment and military operation. Let's think about, for example, as wind turbine that can create magnetic perturbation of air defense radar. So, Marc Delorme, according to you, is there a way to ensure a smooth coexistence between business and military operations, considering the development of this infrastructure?
It's not only the need to have a smooth coexistence, but a need to operate both. The first example in wind farm, the recent regulation in France now has a requirement for a wind farm operator to equip the wind farm field with some sensor typically video or radar, etc. And they have the requirement to provide the data to the Navy headquarters or to the local Navy global maritime surveillance, which means typically that they have shared interest for some to survey typically locally in terms of assurance that you don't have strange activity in the field of wind farm in order to protect safety and operational product of energy, and a shared interest with the Navy to have advanced sensor at sea, to have a better lecture of the maritime picture around. And this is exactly the same that we are thinking about for the cables. And of course, when we are talking about transparency, of course, the operator of the cable itself is interested in having a local detection to protect with a short notice some activity which can be interfere with the cable and occur some damage. But of course, depending the type of target you can detect, of course, it interests also the Navy to have a better view of the global three-dimension maritime picture. So obviously, it's a common and shared interest, and that's why we have to design this service as a service for the business, civilian business, in terms of operator of the cable itself, and in terms of service for the navies to provide better view and better data in the field. And for us, we are at the momentum where this economic model is not in place, actually. We are developing this type of technology and solution, which are in a visible horizon now accessible and quite powerful. But the economic model is not totally in place. I mean, the operator itself are ready to pay a little bit to have some tools of detection, and they are trying to pay a little bit, but it's not always the case. And typically, a cut for a telecom cable could be repaired in 1 week to 3 weeks and cost between 1 and 2 million euro. A cut in a power cable needs 2 to 4 months or 6 months to be repaired and cost more than a few decades of €1 million. So it's not the same scale. So in terms of business interest, some operators are more ready to pay for system for detection than the others, because they have a direct interest in the production and risk that they have for their own business. But on the contrary, as it is huge investment sometimes, they turn to the states asking for navies, governmental organization, but as it is at sea, this is the job of national organization or navies to support and to deliver the knowledge of the activity and protect the infrastructure. So today, we are in the between. The private operator try to discover the technology and are ready to pay a little bit, but we are not at the level. I'm talking about the whole European country. We are not at the level to have a huge and strong activity, technologically speaking, to address this question altogether.
You discussed about protection, about risk. Amiral Maleterre, as you were the chair of the Task Force Ukraine at the Joint Staff, the war in Ukraine demonstrated the importance of unmanned assets in attacking critical infrastructure in the Black Sea. Is, in your opinion, the drone the absolute weapon in terms of green waters warfare?
Yes, to be honest with you, it was not just about critical undersea infrastructures or offshore infrastructure, but also warship. And in the Black Sea, Ukrainian Navy has been incredibly successful. Ukrainian Navy began at the early stage of the war in Ukraine to try to block the Russian trying to damage, the grain corridor between Odessa and the Turkish Straits. They use, it was a combination of cruise missiles and drones. And it is a clear demonstration what can be done with unmanned and autonomous system and in the modern naval warfare, because it's a big change of mindset. If you don't understand that, you will lose. At the moment, we are in the concept you need to choose between adapt or die, to be very sharp, if you want. And the sea change is almost impossible to overstate. USV, UUV, UAV, edge computing drone. We talked that with Admiral Codel this morning about edge strategy, delivering operational effects to gain operational advantage, decision superiority. We see what can be done with drones or swarm of drones. And the result is very clear. Since early 2024, the Ukrainian managed to push back the Russian to the far east of the Black Sea to Novorossiysk. And you know that very, very recently they managed to damage a Kilo-class submarine alongside in Novorossiysk. So it's very far from Ukrainian coast. So your question, is drone the absolute weapon in green water, brown water, what you want, shallow waters? I'm not sure. I think we need a mix of capabilities. As a former SSN commander like Marc, and also task force commander in the Indian Ocean, we know that we can sail in some very rough sea. We can have some inhospitable condition when you operate in the ocean. And heavy metal aircraft with people on board, big submarine, powerful submarine with people on board are part of the system of a system approach. So the mix of capabilities are critical. And to me, it's not a sprint at the moment. It's a marathon. It's a journey where each navies make themselves open to industry, because we need to be prepared to have open architectures, if you want, because the OODA loop, when you draw the lesson learned in Ukraine, the OODA loop, the loop in 4 steps, observe, orient, define, act, it's running, it's not a question of months, it's a question of weeks and perhaps sometimes of days. So that's a big change of mindset. So there is a lot of company now proposing to the navies a lot of drones for persistent ISR, for anti-submarine warfare, and we work with Thales in the British ambition to set up Atlantic Bastion or Atlantic Net, but also for the protection of CUI. This morning, the 5 chiefs of Navy mentioned the difficulties in terms of human resource. So the new technologies, that means robotics, artificial intelligence, cyber, new space, will help to solve the problems and to poise in the specific area, particularly to gain the maximum of information. Because at the moment, you win if you have access of the data and if you are able to deal with big data. So yes, that's a big change, but we need this mix of capabilities.
What's very interesting with this topic of critical offshore infrastructure, of green water, etc., is that the different issues depends on the point of view. And Annabelle, I'm turning to you to have the point of view of the energy sector, let's say, and to know if you foresee specific issues for the future development of offshore energy assets, especially in terms of sea-land balance for networks, considering what we discussed already about the vulnerability, the critical issues, the difficulties to protect the offshore assets.
I think the signals we are already seeing that, they were, to take, for instance, a very concrete example with Sweden that decided, I think it was years ago, to completely cancel the different projects for wind parks, actually for military reasons, already show that there are plenty, let's say, of reasons, let's say, to show some skepticism as well for the future, or let's say it's less bright that might that some might hope, let's say. But maybe on that, from a very purely energy perspective, there are two main aspects maybe I could highlight here. I will try to remain concise once more. The first one is really about the grid balance, actually. So basically, not going too much in details, but actually, when you are talking about electricity, it's really all about finding the balance between what you are producing and what you are consuming exactly at the same time. And when I say exactly, it's really in terms of seconds, actually. So basically, what does it mean is if you have a transmission cable in a very concrete case of, for instance, of hybrid threat or let's say hybrid attack, and that you don't have the capacities that is available, in the territory to compensate the potential loss, actually, that this cable is transiting, in terms of volume of power. If you don't have this capacity to switch on and to recover it, basically you are fearing very concretely a blackout. This is this is sometimes to take not as seriously, in the sense of it's not necessary nationally. It can be firstly on a regional level, but still it can happen and much easier than we might think, actually, because the idea from the energy sector is of course that it doesn't happen, that we don't experience blackouts. But the thing is, we are already still, it's still under tensions, and since actually the energy sector is one of the, let's say, easiest and best target actually for hybrid threats, it's really something to take into account. And related to that, it has been also mentioned the question of costs, actually, and also when you are talking about the damages, it's already a thing, and because just once more a very concrete example, some cables, let's say, are transporting a big volume of electricity. It is the case, for instance, between Germany and Norway, but then when you are looking between Finland and Estonia, it's actually not that huge, as amount of electricity. But it is still very critical, and especially for Finland and Estonia, because from an Estonian perspective, they don't have that much, let's say, possibilities to supply their electricity. It means they are producing a bit already, with oil shale. They are importing from Latvia with hydropower when it's available, but actually, they don't have many other sources, actually. And when we are talking about diversification, those cables between Finland and Estonia are absolutely critical in this case. So therefore, actually, when we are talking about costs, it's of course related to the damages, but it's also related to the securitization in itself. We had already some illustrations from the technological point of view, so I don't want to come back on that. But one main aspect, what we can see, especially in Europe, and I think it's also related to your question about that could be, as long as it's not cleared, the question of the governance, actually, who is doing what exactly. When it's about the protection of the critical infrastructures, it would be, a problem, actually, in order to push those energy projects. Why so? Because in France, we have this wonderful, I don't know the translation for l'action d'État en mer, but the thing is, it doesn't exist in different countries, even in Europe. So actually there you have to switch between the coast guards, between sometimes the military, between the NATO or not. And when it's about a cross-border energy project in this case, then you have all the questions about the coordination between even different countries. And still those, so even if you are, let's say, more to maybe coordinate, those infrastructures are still extremely critical for all of them, So I really think this question of governance, as long as it's not completely cleared, will remain actually a huge set of questions, actually, even for the private sector and the military.
You touched the point about governance, and I will ask the last question before opening the question to the floor. Captain Warnar, from a military point of view, do you think that's more than the issue of equipment? Of course, we discussed technology in this panel because it's very important. Yet, more than the issue, the navies need to adapt their organization or procedures to ensure an appropriate defense of this critical offshore infrastructure.
Yeah. Well, to answer that question, we need to analyze what actually the navies do in this in this area. And roughly, following doctrine, there's two type of tasks here. First of all, there's a constabulary task, policing the seas, maintaining good order. That is something we are familiar with in counter-piracy operations, in counter-drugs operations. That's a job we know quite well how to do, but that's a job dealing with criminals, that have a very logic, rational calculus that we can we know how to do that. Here we got civil opponents as well. It could be shadow ships, etc. Civil, but this is a different game. These are state-sponsored ships. So an intervention with a shadow fleet ship also means potential escalation with another country. So that's the domain of naval diplomacy or coercion and risk management. And the challenge here in protecting critical infrastructure is that we have to cover or be prepared to fill this whole spectrum here of operations. And to do that, there's other examples here. So, for example, in the Persian Gulf, Iran, the American Navy has been dealing with sanction breakers, etc. But that is still a limited space, not that big an area, with limited number of incidents. So that may not be the very good example. And the other big example, obviously, is everything happening in the South China Sea, where China very much well understands how to deal with this game. So therefore they have designed, or they have this, this huge Coast Guard-wide fleet, which allows them to be present and intervene anywhere in this huge area of the Pacific, creating a problem of asymmetry for particularly the American Navy. Even with the largest Navy, it is impossible to react with every incident on every fishing vessel incident, which is driven by fishermen or Coast Guard ships. But the American Navy does not have enough ships to react to any incidents. So they need to make a choice what to react or not. On the other end of the spectrum, there's countries, for example, like Indonesia. They have a different strategy. They have very much a good order Navy. They have a police force Navy, patrol vessels, which allow them to, makes it possible to keep the Chinese Coast Guard or shipsmen at bay, but simultaneously not escalating the crisis with China, because China is, for a country like Indonesia, their main trading partner as well. So there's no interest to escalate much more than needed. Now, what could we learn from that for Europe? How should the European response be to this kind of threat? Well, possibly something in between those two kinds of strategy, of not being such a big military power as the US, but analyzing this. And I think we need to element, there's two types of tasks. There's detection and deterrence on one hand, and then that could be follow-up in kind of an incident with an intervention. Managing an intervention, that's obviously quite often, that's a Navy's job. That's and obviously it's a challenging job, particularly in the Baltic Sea. We've had this hailing of shadow fleet. Sometimes the Russia has reacted by sending fighter aircraft in, so then it becomes a complicated situation. Obviously, we have to be aware of the danger of escalation in these kinds of water, because in the Baltic, also Navy ships can become very vulnerable. But also, on the other hand, I think this is also a game that receives full attention. We have all NATO working on these kinds of scenarios, how we deal with that. We have our procedures in place to do that. This is kind of our daily bread and butter. We know how to do that. The other thing, in the terms of detecting detection and deterrence, because we are very much looking for a mechanism for detection, deterrence by denial, creating this transparent, making it impossible for a shadow fleet to do illicit operations. And I think a warship is probably not the very effective way as a deterrent force, But and therefore, in this is very much of a Coast Guard type of operation, The Coast Guard has a much better situational awareness, at least in my country on the North Sea. It's the Coast Guard that has all the information, and I think it's particularly this area that we need much more to improve. I'm not saying that we do a good job as a Navy, but here, this is the area that we need to improve on. We need to scale up our Coast Guard assets. They need more personnel to make all these analysis. They need more combining all these information system. Yeah, because it's not only AAS information and the name of a ship and where it's heading to, and is this course and ship course and speed, is that making it dangerous. No, it is about combining, who's owning the cargo, yeah, what is the crew, is what people, who's hiring that, how is the ship insured. It is combining all these kind of information, and you need people combining all that to create this transparency, and I think that is an area that we need much more to govern all, and we've had a word before, governance at all, that is the weak area. Yeah, we got an area, our Coast Guard is being run by 7 different departments, all debating among each other who's going to pay for what bill, and it hasn't been sorted out yet. Yeah, so government is a big issue, not only for all the legal complexities that is involved, but also the multiplicity of all the different objectives here. In any incident with infrastructure or oil, it is there's different ways of looking at it. It is it's potentially a sanction breaker. There could be environmental issues in it. It could be all these different objectives, and therefore we need this whole government thing. These are all areas that are only at the start of being developed.
Thank you. Admiral, please.
Just commentary about when you talk about shadow fleet or ghost fleet. I think we need to be very prudent, because to me we are helping the Russian narrative. There is no ghost fleet, to be honest with you. We know where they are. It's illegal shipping. Sometimes the flag is missing. They have no insurance, so they can be boarded in international waters. But it's not ghost fleet, to be honest. It's so easy to track them. And coming back to my experience in NATO, when you are 32 nations, and particularly in the Baltic with 8 NATO nations, you can trust me, you can collect all this information coming from radar, from warship, from different assets, satellites, and you have a very good picture where is the situation. So, and we are very comfortable to track this type of ships. Afterwards, it's a question of political decision.